Happy Tuesday, guys. Let's talk about terrorism. Gosh, that's a rough intro. Oh well, I'm not really sure how to intro this one, so we'll just go ahead and start. Today what we're going to be doing is trying to work our way through the notion of what terror is, what its goals are, and how it works in the modern world. So terrorism is one of those concepts that is really hard for us to talk about without getting emotional. And it's okay if you do. But I am going to ask that you kind of take it slow, that you jot down questions as they occur to you, because I am going to ask you to use those questions later on, okay? So, excuse me, that'll teach me to go sit outside and plan lessons. This dang pollen, man. Now, where do we draw these lines? So the first question we got to ask is, of course, one that is definitional. What is terrorism? Normally in class, I would pause here for about 2 minutes and actually have you come up with a definition, because I don't want to move on until I know that you have thought about it. I don't want to just give you a rote answer. So I am going to ask that you pause the video here. Hit pause. Do it. I want you to answer that question. What is terrorism? Do you think you have an answer now? Good. Let's move on. So the first thing I want to tell you about terrorism is that terrorism, unlike revolutions, which we said can be violent, but they don't have to be. There's nothing explicit about what they're doing that must require violence. Terrorism always involves violence. 100%. A definition of terrorism that we can work off of is that it is the use of violence by non-state actors against civilians in order to achieve a political goal, or the deliberate creation and exploitation of fear through violence or the threat of violence to achieve political or social change. So what we have to unpack about this is that, first of all, terrorists are people who are not associated with the state. That means that they are not the legitimate use of force. They are not the police. They are not the military. Now, we will talk about state violence in a moment, and that involves the police, and that involves the military. But in this case, when we're talking about terrorism, we are talking about people who are operating outside. Now, they may be officially members of those organizations, but they are not acting as members of those organizations, if that makes sense. So you could have a terrorist who holds a job as a police officer, but they are not acting in their capacity as a police officer when they carry out the act of terror. So the direct act of violence is terrorism, but so too is the creation and exploitation of fear through the threat of violence. So if there is a violent threat or the possibility of violence, and that fear creates enough terror in and of itself to create social or political change, that too qualifies as terrorism. Remember what we talked about with regards to violence, that narrowing of choice, that limiting of agency? This is where that creation and exploitation of fear comes in. Generally, when we talk about terrorism, we assume that the people involved are rational actors. What we mean is that we may not like the decision they come to. We may think it is immoral, unethical, or even psychopathic. But ultimately, we believe that there is some degree of strategy involved. That this is not just random action. This is action that has usually ideation behind it. And that generally speaking, there is some sort of logic, even if we find it to be deeply disturbing. So there are a number of different types of terrorism that we can talk about. The first type of terror is state terror. This is the violence against civilians for political aims done within the state itself. So state terror is a form of terrorism, but using state actors against civilians. So think about Mao's use of re-education camps or Stalin's use of the gulags. That is a campaign of terror. But it doesn't qualify in terms of like what we normally consider terrorist activity because it involves state actors. There's state-sponsored terror, which is what we will talk about with regards to Iran. And that is where a state decides not to sort of get its hands dirty directly, but instead almost hire a third-party agent to act as a proxy. And this is frequently what occurs with regards to, say, Iran. The state of Iran has a lot of interesting financial connections to groups that have involved themselves in terror. And so we can talk about state-sponsored terror, but again, it's not in the same sort of notion as having the regular military or the regular police force carry out the act. And then you have post-revolutionary state terror, where essentially trying to keep the revolution going becomes necessary. It becomes necessary, or at least it's argued that it is necessary, to keep terror alive, that the fear of violence is what keeps people on their revolutionary toes. This is best expressed through, say, the reign of terror in France during the French Revolution. Although, frankly, you could also look at Mao and his Cultural Revolution as post-revolutionary state terror. What Mao was doing there was trying to kind of gin up support for the revolution 20 years after it had already ended. Now, I do also want to draw a distinction between other types of violence that are political and terrorism, because often they get conflated. I want to draw a different line between guerrilla violence, or guerrilla if you want to say it like that, and terrorism. So I'm going to say it as guerrilla violence because I like it, and also because I think it emphasizes what the actual word means. Guerra in Spanish is war. Guerrilla is little war. So guerrilla violence is distinctly different from terrorism because, generally speaking, guerrilla violence is, first of all, small and targeted. Guerrilla fighting is usually done when you don't have a full military or you don't have overwhelming forces, so you're not interested in holding territory. Usually you're trying to strike really hard at a given target and then withdraw, doing maximum damage but not losing a huge number on your end. So generally speaking, guerrilla violence targets what we call hard targets. That means usually state targets, targets that are non-civilian. So hard targets would be governmental institutions, police barracks, military barracks, military installations themselves. So a really good example of guerrilla violence would be in 1953, prior to the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro decided to enact revolution in 1953. It didn't go well. He and his guerrillas decided to attack a place called Moncada Barracks in Santiago de Cuba, which is, frankly, if it's a clear day, you can see Haiti from Santiago de Cuba. And he decided to attack the military installation there to launch his revolution. It failed miserably, and Fidel Castro and his merry bang of guerrillas were expelled from Cuba. Some were executed, and Fidel was then relocated to Mexico, where eventually he met Che Guevara, and then things happened. But generally speaking, guerrilla violence kind of accepts the rules of war. Like, guerrillas usually feel, or rather guerreros, people who fight a guerrilla war are guerreros, they usually feel that they are soldiers. They think of themselves as soldiers. They're just non-state soldiers. And so they take prisoners of war. They usually try not to, often, involve themselves too much in terror tactics and torture, and there's a very good reason for it. Usually what they're doing is they're targeting the state, not civilians. Sometimes civilians get caught up in these conflicts, but they are not the primary target. And the reason that they're targeting the state is that the state, as much as guerrillas hate them, as much as guerrilla forces may hate the state, they see the state as legitimate in that it holds power and it is heavily institutionalized. So clearly that's where you aim your target. So, for example, when we talk about the FARC in, say, Colombia, if you are familiar with, say, like the drug wars in Colombia, and the insurgency that developed down there around the FARC, which is a guerrilla group that was also involved in drug smuggling and all sorts of stuff. The FARC eventually negotiated face to face with the Colombian government. And the reason they were able to do that is because the FARC ultimately recognized the state as legitimate, that there is an element of legitimacy there. If you don't think the state is legitimate, then there's no way you can possibly negotiate with them because you don't think they're real, right? So guerrilla violence is usually, you've got a political group that is acting against the state, but they also still see the state as the heart of power. Terrorism disagrees. Terrorism often targets hard targets, but it often, and very much especially today, uses soft targets. So hard targets are targets that are military or state-oriented. They are tied to the military or to the state. Soft targets are anywhere at any time. The soft targets are banal. They are the grocery store. They are the mall. They are the farmer's market. They are anywhere the public is. And the reason for this is because terrorism sees state actors as illegitimate. They do not see the state as something legitimate, so why bother targeting the state? The problem isn't the state. The problem is everything. So, let's get into this. If it's been a little bit hard for you to kind of wrap your head around thinking about different forms of state and political violence, I want you to draw out this 4x4 into your notes. On one axis, on the y-axis, I want you to draw out target. Closest to the 0 needs to be non-state, further away is state. On the x-axis, I need you to draw state and non-state again. State closest, non-state furthest out this time. And that is actor. Okay, so on the X, we're looking at who is acting, and then we're looking at who they're acting against on the Y. So if we have state actors targeting other states, what you're looking at in terms of political violence is war. If one state is targeting another state, that's warfare. That's what that is. If you have a non-state actor, a group of insurgents, guerreros, who are fighting up against the state itself, then what you are looking at is guerrilla war. Okay, so guerrilla war, you have non-state actors targeting the state. They're generally speaking not targeting civilians. And then, if you have the state targeting non-state actors, that is, the state targeting its own civilians, then you are talking about human rights violations, and those are domestic. Okay, so if you've got the Myanmar government targeting Rohingya populations within its borders, those are crimes against humanity and human rights violations, but they're done within borders. If you have the state targeting non-state actors in a different country across their border outside of their own sovereignty, then we are talking war crimes. If a state targets civilians outside of their own borders, that's straight up war crimes. And then you get to go to The Hague and be tried. And then if you have non-state actors who are targeting other non-state actors, that is, civilians targeting civilians, or people outside of the structure of the state targeting civilians, that is classic terrorism. And then we can try to kind of like blur this even further. If you have the state acting through non-state actors and targeting civilians, then you've got state-sponsored terrorism. So hopefully, like, thinking about who acts and who they are targeting helps in terms of figuring out what kind of political violence we are looking at here. Now, I'm going to pause here because I don't want to get into strategies right now. I want to move into the next video just so we understand. Like, I know that heading looks terrible. This is not a how-to, okay? I want to make that very, very clear. So I'm going to move on into the next video before I run out of recording time.